PU leather is a synthetic material made using plastic polymer. It's made to be an animal leather alternative. Through various steps, PU leather can achieve a similar color, texture, durability, flame resistance, UV protection, and even smell as animal leather. PU leather may cost around $1 to $3 per square foot. This is a synthetic leather that is created using polyurethane. The material attempts to recreate the qualities of leather in a more sustainable and economically friendly way. To do so, the material is completely man-made, using chemicals mixed in to provide color, smell, flame retardants, and UV protection. This mixture is bonded to a backing that is typically fabric or paper-like. The resulting material is a sheet of durable plastic that is made to look and smell just like natural leather. PU leather was first created in the 1950s. Before this, there was a faux leather made using paper pulp which would fail quickly and disintegrate over time. The solution to this problem was to use polyurethane attached to a fabric backing that could then be embossed with the texture of leather. While this proved to be more durable, the leather still had trouble with longevity due to the material becoming brittle. Although no permanent solution has been found today, manufacturers are incorporating UV protection into their products. This allows PU leather to better withstand exposure to the sun during daily use, and including innovations such as this have brought PU leather closer to the longevity of natural animal leather. So broadly speaking, this really isn't a leather material per se, it is in general plastic. Although with that, let's take a close look and see what this looks like zoomed in. So here, in the top of PU leather, we see a really interesting surface. It's very, very smooth compared to natural leather. We're not seeing those holes or scuff marks or any kind of natural blemishes to it, because this is a man-made material with a purpose to be made very consistently and evenly. And we see that reflected right here on the surface. There is some texture to it, though in general, it's relatively smooth, even, and consistent. Looking at the bottom, we see a similar approach, even though it is a little bit different in texture. Now it's interesting because natural leather typically has a tighter surface texture on the top and a little more of a more open grain pattern on the bottom. And in this PU leather, it almost looks like the bottom has a little bit more of an open grain pattern as well, even though it's completely man-made. So due to that process, different textures can be set in place, and here we're seeing a little bit more of an open one on the bottom, even though it's still a very thick and consistent material throughout, which we see really clearly right here. So in the section of PU leather, we see, abundantly clearly that it is the same material throughout. In natural leather, we typically see a grain progression where it's tighter at the top and then gets a little more open towards the middle and a little wider and looser towards the bottom. Here, it is essentially a consistently thick pore of that PU, polyurethane, that creates this material. And so it's really easy to see and really interesting too that in this cross section, it's pretty much just the same throughout. In a positive, that can give it some more consistent durability and performance characteristics, since it can be more controlled than a natural fiber, although we're going to find out that typically benefits it in the near term and not as much as the long term as in natural leather. But either way, really cool to see this. For the production process, the main part of PU leather is the coating that will be added later to the backing of fabric. Sometimes there is a fabric backing, sometimes it is just consistently thick polyurethane. When we look at the fabric backed variety, this usually starts by adding a plasticizer to a large vat. The plasticizer helps improve the flexibility of the final product, as well as make it softer. UV protection, as well as a flame retardant solution, can also be added to the mixture at this time. While it is all coming together, polyurethane is poured in. This is the main ingredient for making PU leather, providing the stability, durability, and the body of the top surface. At this time, dye is usually added to the mixture, giving the leather any color that is desired. Once the mixture is finished, it can be bonded to a backing material using a heat press. The most common backings are a paper-like material or a fabric. Once poured on top, a heat press bonds the two materials together, and it can also be used to add texture. helping the PU leather to look more similar to various animal hides. And again, in this production process, since it is man-made, there are so many variables that can be altered depending on the preferred end result, how you want it to look. If you want it to look like a particular type of leather, smell like a certain type of leather, have a backing to it, no backing. It's pretty much open to the imagination in terms of how one wants to design and create this material since it's man-made. So there's a lot of opportunity there. When looking at production volume, there's around 40 billion square feet of PU leather produced each year. The key countries for production generally include China and Taiwan. The largest exporting country is usually China, and the largest importing country is often Vietnam. When looking at cost, it's around $1 to $3 per square foot for PU leather. And a lot of what drives the cost differences are going to be those characteristics that are added to it during production. And that can be a lot from the texturizing, the colorants, if there's any kind of UV protection, all those different variables that go into it can lead to the variations in the prices as well. Let's take a look at the pros. So PU leather was introduced as a leather alternative, and it's performed really well in that regard. It has also surpassed real animal leather in meaningful ways, eliminating the need for animals and reducing the environmental impact. And that leads to a few great things. One is that, beyond the obvious of not needing the animals in the production process, it also can cost much less to produce. And that makes it much more available and usable for projects. Another great pro is that it can be produced in larger sizes. Since we're not limited by any type of a natural constraint, these can be made pretty much as large as the machinery that is used to produce it. And especially when talking about rolls of it, those rolls can be made extremely long and large, which can lead to options for projects that we may not be able to do with natural leather, but we can now do with a PU leather. It also offers better consistency with no flaws. Since this is a manufactured type of material, we have a lot more control over how it looks and how it comes out. And so depending on what you're working on, if you're looking for something that's going to be consistent over this piece and that piece, if you're making 5, 10, 20,000 different pieces of whatever item you're working on, a material like this can offer better consistency since it is a much more controlled material. Also, it offers opportunity for project designs that we couldn't as easily make with a natural leather. For example, in marine upholstery, where the material is going to be subjected to a lot of harsh environments in terms of salty water, salty air, maybe harsh weather conditions. Having something that is essentially a plastic can be really useful in those environments and lead to a much longer lifespan for those products than if it were, a natural leather per se that was out, exposed to the elements 24/7. It can also be really useful for public transit upholstery and things like that, where you get a high amount of wear and use every day, and without necessarily needing the cost to replace it as quickly as it would be with natural leather. So there are some cases where, even though this is essentially just plastic, it may have a lot of really good uses and open up new project potentials depending on what it's used for. And here are some cons. Despite attempting to recreate animal leather using other materials, PU leather does not quite capture the same high quality product. While the material can be purchased at a lower price, there are some trade-offs to consider when using PU leather. One is that it can become more brittle over time. Due to the additives and just the structural nature of the material, it can become more brittle a lot faster than a natural leather. As such, it has a significantly shorter lifespan than natural leathers. In general, this may be a couple years to a little more, whereas a natural leather can be, when properly cared for, used for decades, if not hundreds of years. Also, PU leather does not breathe well. Being that it's not a natural fiber and it is essentially just a layer of plastic, there doesn't allow for a lot of airflow through it. And so depending on what it's being used for, that may not be great if you're looking for a material and an application use where you want a little more of that airflow through and with the item. And lastly, it has a bit of an artificial feeling to the material. Now, of course, it's not natural, so yes, it's going to feel artificial. That said, depending on what you're using it for, that may not be something that's preferred if you're really looking for that natural leather feel. All right, let's look at some good uses. So with PU leather being a leather alternative, it is often used on many of the same goods as a natural leather. The materials can behave similarly in some cases while providing a lower cost to the producer and ultimately, to your customer. Some of these items could include wallets, bags, clothing, jackets, pants, including things like belts, small pouches, and pretty much any accessory that you'd make with a natural leather, you can make with a PU leather. So here's a few tips for working with PU leather. In a lot of cases, it's similar to working with a natural leather. It will generally mark the same. It'll cut potentially smoother, given that it is a consistent material, and you're going to get, in terms of flexibility, depending on your PU leather, some similar characteristics to a natural leather. That said, some things to keep in mind is that keep your tools very sharp and well maintained when working with PU leather. That's because it is a plastic material, so any kind of little jumps or scratches or things that you impress upon it may actually be left into that surface and become visible in the finished product. So if you have nice sharp tools, you can make easy clean cuts, and that'll make the fit and finish of your finalized pieces look professional and nice. Also, if you can, work on the back side of the material. This will help to avoid creating kind of a bumpy texture, misaligning tools, depending on where it's being used, if you have a texture. Some PU leathers do have a texture applied to the surface. In those cases, when you're doing your cutting, measuring, and marking, it may make sense to do that on the back side, and that way you have a nice smoother side to cut on if you're working with a textured surface. And lastly, test your PU leather. When you get a new material, depending on its color, thickness, texture, if you can, get a little bit of scrap and just use your tools on it. They may respond a little differently. They may feel a little different in your hand. You may get a little bit of a different result than you may get if you're working on a natural leather. So just test those first, and that way you'll have a feel for how they respond and the end result you're getting. That way when you move on to your actual project piece, you'll be comfortable knowing that what you're doing will generally end in the result that you're looking for and make that process a whole lot easier. So that is a look into PU leather. It can be controversial for some, saying, hey, it's not even leather. What are you calling it leather for? And it's just plastic. But part of what we do is we, talk about things in the way that folks are familiar with. And that way, you understand, a lot of people call it PU leather. And so if we talk about it in that sense, we can at least begin to kind of connect and help people understand a little more about what it's about. So technically speaking, you could probably call it plastic, or polyurethane. And then separately, call leather, natural leather as it is. So with this, do as you wish. But in terms of projects, there's definitely a lot of folks that use this material to create some really nice, looking goods that can kind of mirror to some degree the same characteristics of a natural leather. It may not last as long, but for some projects, it's going to be inexpensive and work really great depending on what you're doing. So if you're looking for a new type of leather to try out, this may lead to some new opportunities that you haven't come across yet with a natural leather. And PU has some unique characteristics that you could definitely take advantage of. So if you've tried this before, let us know what your experience has been. If you have any questions about using it, let us know. And for our next project, this could be a really great option to lead to some really interesting, innovative, and unique results.